You think you can ignore my orders and just sit there like you on the road? Step out of the car before I make you. On what should have been a routine traffic stop on a quiet rural highway, an arrogant police officer decided to intimidate and assault a calm black woman he believed was powerless, never realizing that the woman he was threatening had the discipline and training to turn the entire situation against him in seconds. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun stretched across the empty highway outside the city limits, casting long amber reflections over the rolling fields that bordered the road. Tanya Brooks drove steadily along the narrow two-lane stretch, the hum of her engine blending with the distant sound of wind moving through the tall grass along the roadside. It had been a long day at the rehabilitation clinic where she worked, helping patients regain strength after injuries and surgeries. Most evenings, she welcomed the quiet drive home as a chance to let the stress of the day fade away. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel while the radio played softly in the background. The road ahead was nearly empty, with only the occasional passing vehicle breaking the stillness. A few miles behind her, a black and white patrol cruiser sat partially hidden beside a row of trees that bordered the highway. Inside the cruiser, Officer Daniel Hayes leaned forward behind the wheel, watching the road with the restless focus that had defined most of his patrol shifts. Beside him sat Officer Chris Walker, who scanned the patrol tablet with the relaxed posture of someone expecting a quiet evening. "Looks like another slow shift," Walker muttered without looking up. Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes had already locked onto the approaching vehicle moving down the road toward them. Tanya's car passed the parked cruiser at a normal speed, her brake lights glowing briefly as she adjusted to the curve ahead. There was nothing unusual about the vehicle. It was clean, well-maintained, and moving exactly with the flow of traffic. But Hayes had already decided something was wrong. "There," he said suddenly, straightening in his seat. Walker looked up. "What about it?" Hayes nodded, toward Tanya's car, now disappearing around the bend. "That one." Walker frowned slightly. She was not speeding. Hayes had already started the engine. The cruiser rolled onto the highway with a sudden burst of acceleration as he flipped on the flashing lights. Red and blue reflections burst across the pavement behind Tanya's car. Ahead of them, Tanya noticed the lights in her mirror and calmly guided her vehicle toward the shoulder of the road. Gravel crunched softly beneath the tires as she came to a stop. The patrol cruiser pulled in behind her with the authority of someone who believed the next few minutes would belong entirely to him. Officer Hayes stepped out of the cruiser and began walking toward the driver's side door, completely unaware that the woman sitting calmly behind the wheel had spent years in the military learning exactly how to stay composed when someone tried to take control of the situation. Officer Daniel Hayes stopped beside Tanya Brooks's driver's side window and leaned down slightly, resting one hand against the top edge of the door as if claiming the entire situation before a single word had been spoken. The flashing patrol lights painted streaks of red and blue across the quiet highway shoulder, while the wind moved softly through the grass beyond the roadside. Tanya kept both hands visible on the steering wheel exactly where he could see them. Hayes tapped the glass with 2 fingers. "Roll the window down." Tanya lowered it calmly. "Good evening, officer," she said evenly. Hayes did not respond to the greeting. His eyes moved across the interior of the car, scanning the dashboard, the passenger seat, and the back seat as if expecting to find something suspicious hiding in plain sight. "License and registration," he said sharply. Tanya reached slowly into the small compartment beside the seat and retrieved her documents. She handed them to him without hesitation. Hayes glanced at the license briefly before looking back at her again with narrowed eyes. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Work," Tanya replied. "Where is that?" "The rehabilitation clinic in town." Hayes tilted his head slightly. "You work in healthcare?" Tanya nodded once. "Yes." Hayes studied her again for a long moment, clearly searching for a reason to justify the stop he had already decided to make. "Step out of the car," he ordered suddenly. Tanya blinked once, but remained calm. "May I ask why?" Hayes straightened slightly, his voice rising. "Because I told you to." Tanya unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder beside the road. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as she closed the car door behind her. Officer Chris Walker approached from the passenger side of the cruiser, watching the scene with a cautious expression. Hayes walked slowly around Tanya's vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel while he examined it, as if searching for evidence that only he could see. "What exactly were you doing out here?" he asked. "Driving home," Tanya answered calmly. Hayes stopped near the rear of the car and glanced back toward her. "You seem very relaxed for someone who just got pulled over." Tanya met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to hide." Hayes laughed under his breath. "Everyone says that." Walker shifted slightly. "Daniel, she was not speeding." Hayes waved him off without even turning his head. "I'm still talking." He stepped closer to Tanya again and pointed toward the hood of the patrol cruiser. "Hands on the car." Tanya hesitated only briefly before walking to the cruiser and placing her palms against the warm metal surface. Passing vehicles slowed slightly as drivers noticed the flashing lights and the roadside stop unfolding in the open afternoon air. Hayes moved behind her and reached for the handcuffs on his belt, the metal clinking softly as he lifted them into view. "You know what your problem is?" he said quietly. Tanya turned her head, just enough to see him. "What is my problem?" Hayes gave a thin smile as the cuffs glinted in the sunlight. "You think you are in control of this situation." He had no idea that the calm woman standing in front of him had already recognized exactly where this encounter was heading. Officer Daniel Hayes lifted the handcuffs slightly, letting the steel links clink together as he stepped closer behind Tanya Brooks. The late afternoon wind moved across the roadside grass while the flashing patrol lights continued reflecting off the side of her car. Tanya stood calmly with her palms resting against the hood of the cruiser, her posture steady and balanced. She did not tense, did not argue, and did not raise her voice. Hayes mistook that calm for submission. "You see," he said quietly, leaning closer to her shoulder, "people always think they can talk their way out of this." Tanya glanced slightly over her shoulder. "Talk my way out of what?" Hayes chuckled. "Whatever you were planning." The cuff snapped around her right wrist with a sharp metallic click. Officer Chris Walker shifted uncomfortably a few feet away, his eyes moving between Hayes and Tanya. "Daniel," he said carefully, "this is not necessary." Hayes ignored him completely. He grabbed Tanya's other wrist and began pulling it behind her back. The second cuff had not closed yet when Tanya spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Hayes," she said quietly, "you should let go of my arm." Hayes tightened his grip slightly. "Or what?" he asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. The highway remained quiet except for the faint sound of distant traffic. Tanya slowly shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Hayes did not notice the movement. His focus remained fixed on the handcuff he was trying to close. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. Tanya's voice remained steady. "I warned you." Hayes laughed again and forced her wrist downward toward the cruiser hood. That was the moment everything changed. In one smooth motion, Tanya turned her body slightly, pivoting her shoulder while redirecting the grip Hayes had placed on her arm. His balance shifted instantly. The second cuff slipped from his fingers as his stance collapsed forward. Before he understood what had happened, Tanya used the momentum of his own movement to guide him downward. Hayes stumbled hard and dropped to one knee on the gravel beside the cruiser. The sudden reversal stunned him. Walker took a step forward but froze when he saw Tanya release Hayes immediately instead of pressing the advantage. She stepped back calmly, the single cuff still hanging loosely from her wrist. Hayes looked up from the ground, his face filled with shock as he struggled to understand how the woman he believed he controlled had moved faster than he could react. Tanya stood a few feet away now, relaxed but alert, her hands open at her sides. "I told you to stop touching me," she said calmly. Hayes pushed himself to his feet again, breathing harder now, the arrogance in his posture suddenly replaced with confusion. Walker stared at both of them in disbelief. The quiet highway stretched out behind them while the flashing patrol lights continued painting the roadside in red and blue. And standing there beside the cruiser, Officer Daniel Hayes realized something he had not considered when the traffic stop began. The calm woman he had tried to overpower had never been afraid of him at all. Officer Daniel Hayes pushed himself off the gravel with a sharp breath, brushing dirt from his knee as he stared at Tanya Brooks with a mixture of shock and anger. The quiet stretch of highway seemed suddenly charged with tension. The flashing red and blue patrol lights continued to pulse across the road and the side of Tanya's car, painting the moment in slow, alternating colors. Officer Chris Walker stood frozen near the cruiser, clearly stunned by how quickly the situation had changed. Hayes took one step forward, his pride clearly wounded. "You just assaulted a police officer," he snapped, though his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. Tanya remained exactly where she stood, calm and balanced, the single cuff still hanging loosely from one wrist where Hayes had partially secured it. Her breathing was steady, her expression composed. "No," she replied evenly. "I defended myself when you grabbed me." Hayes clenched his jaw and reached toward his radio, as if preparing to call for backup. His movements were sharper now, driven more by frustration than control. "You think this is over," he said, raising the radio to his shoulder. "You just made this a whole lot worse for yourself." Walker stepped forward cautiously. "Daniel, stop." Hayes shot him a sharp look. She resisted arrest. Walker shook his head. "You never had grounds to arrest her." The words hung heavily between them. Hayes turned back toward Tanya again, his earlier arrogance now tangled with embarrassment. Passing drivers slowed even more as they noticed the standoff unfolding beside the cruiser. One pickup truck rolled past slowly, the driver clearly watching the scene before continuing down the highway. Hayes pointed at Tanya. "Turn around," he ordered. Tanya did not move. "Officer Hayes," she said calmly, "you need to take a moment and think about what you are doing." Hayes stepped closer, clearly trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. "You do not give me instructions," he said sharply. Tanya held his gaze steadily. "You are upset because you lost control of the situation." Walker looked between them nervously. Hayes scoffed loudly, though the confidence behind the sound had thinned. "You are still in handcuffs," he replied. Tanya lifted her wrist slightly, letting the loose cuff glint in the fading sunlight. Half of one. Hayes reached down quickly to grab her arm again, determined to finish what he had started. But this time he moved more cautiously. Tanya did not resist. She simply stepped back a half pace, keeping her distance while watching him carefully. "I'm not trying to fight you," she said quietly. "I'm trying to prevent you from making a bigger mistake." Hayes hesitated for just a second, the doubt flickering across his expression before pride pushed it away again. He straightened his shoulders and lifted the remaining cuff. "You had your chance." Tanya's voice remained calm. "So did you." The wind moved across the empty highway as the confrontation balanced on the edge of whatever would happen next. Officer Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on the open handcuff still dangling from Tanya Brooks's wrist and stepped forward again, clearly determined to reclaim the control he had lost only moments earlier. The flashing patrol lights continued washing the roadside in pulses of red and blue, while the wind moved quietly through the tall grass beyond the shoulder of the highway. Tanya stood calmly a few feet from the cruiser, her posture relaxed but alert, the loose cuff glinting faintly in the fading sunlight. Officer Chris Walker shifted nervously beside the patrol car, glancing between the two of them as the tension thickened. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this is not helping." Hayes ignored him. His focus remained locked on Tanya as he raised the second cuff again. "Turn around," he ordered sharply. Tanya did not move. "You are making this worse," Hayes added. Tanya's voice remained calm. "You already crossed that line." Hayes stepped closer, trying to grab her arm again. This time Tanya moved only slightly, shifting her stance just enough that his hand met empty air. The motion was controlled, almost effortless. Hayes froze for half a second, surprised again by how quickly she avoided him. The brief hesitation only made him angrier. "You think you are clever," he snapped. Tanya kept her eyes on him. "No," she replied quietly. "I think you are frustrated." Walker rubbed his forehead, clearly aware the situation had already spiraled too far. Hayes ignored him and lunged again, grabbing Tanya's forearm with more force than before. "You are under arrest," he declared loudly, trying to drown out the doubt creeping into the moment. The words echoed across the quiet highway. Tanya did not panic. Instead, she took one slow step back while turning her shoulder, breaking the pressure of his grip just enough to keep control of her balance. Hayes tried to pull her toward the cruiser again. His movements were rough, driven now by pride rather than procedure. Tanya reacted instinctively. With a quick pivot, she redirected his arm downward, forcing him to stumble forward another step. Hayes caught himself before falling this time, but the moment only deepened the frustration on his face. Walker stepped forward quickly. "Daniel, stop." Hayes pulled his arm free and turned sharply toward Tanya again, breathing harder now. The authority he had relied on at the beginning of the stop was slipping away in front of him, and he knew it. Tanya remained calm, the loose cuff still hanging from her wrist as she watched him carefully. "Officer Hayes," she said evenly, "you are not thinking clearly anymore." Hayes stared at her, the anger slowly mixing with something else beneath it. Doubt. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he was no longer certain that the woman standing in front of him was the easy target he had imagined when he first turned on the flashing lights behind her car. Officer Daniel Hayes stood in the fading light of the roadside shoulder, breathing harder now as the tension of the confrontation settled into the quiet space between him and Tanya Brooks. The flashing patrol lights continued their slow rhythm against the asphalt while the wind carried the distant sound of cars passing along the highway. Tanya remained calm a few feet away from him, the loose handcuff still hanging from her wrist like a quiet reminder of how quickly the situation had slipped beyond his control. Officer Chris Walker stayed near the cruiser, his eyes moving carefully between the two of them. Hayes looked at Tanya again, the earlier arrogance in his expression now mixed with frustration and wounded pride. "You are going to regret this," he said. His voice was lower now, but the anger beneath it was clear. Tanya did not react. She simply watched him with the same steady composure she had shown since. The stop began. Hayes lifted the remaining cuff again, turning it in his hand, as if reminding himself that he still held authority over the moment. "I gave you every chance to cooperate," he continued. Tanya's voice remained calm. "No, you gave yourself every chance to stop." Hayes laughed once, though the sound carried less confidence than before. "You think you can lecture me now?" Tanya shook her head slowly. "I'm trying to give you one last opportunity to walk away from this." Walker glanced at Hayes again, clearly hoping the words might reach him. The road remained quiet around them, the tension lingering like a storm that had not yet broken. Hayes stepped closer again, lifting the open cuff as if preparing to finish securing her hands. "You're still under arrest," he said. Tanya did not move. Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice steady and deliberate. "Officer Hayes, I spent 6 years in the Army learning how to control situations exactly like this." Hayes paused briefly, the words catching him off guard for only a second. Then he scoffed. "Everyone has a story." Tanya met his gaze without raising her voice. "What I am telling you is that you are about to make a decision you cannot undo." Walker shifted his weight uneasily. "Daniel." Hayes cut him off with a quick gesture. "No." He stepped forward again, pride clearly pushing him past the moment of hesitation. "You think you scare me with that?" Tanya's expression remained unchanged. "No," she replied quietly. "I think you should listen." Hayes leaned closer, his voice hard again as he reached for her arm. "You should have listened to me 10 minutes ago." The open cuff moved toward her wrist again as the last chance to end the confrontation quietly slipped past him. Hayes had convinced himself that the calm woman in front of him was still someone he could overpower. And in doing so, he unknowingly walked straight into the final mistake that would end the situation in a way he never expected. Officer Daniel Hayes lunged forward again with the open handcuff, his fingers closing around Tanya Brooks's arm with the desperate determination of someone trying to reclaim control of a situation that had already slipped beyond his grasp. The roadside air seemed to freeze for a moment as the steel cuff moved toward her wrist. But this time Tanya did not simply redirect him. In one controlled motion, she stepped inward instead of away, guiding his grip downward while shifting her balance with practiced precision. Hayes lost his footing instantly. The sudden pivot sent his weight forward and down, the gravel shoulder sliding beneath his boots as his balance collapsed completely. Before he understood what was happening, his shoulders struck the side of the cruiser and his knee dropped hard to the ground. The handcuff fell from his grasp and clattered against the pavement. Officer Chris Walker stared in stunned silence as Hayes struggled to steady himself. Tanya stepped back immediately, creating distance instead of pressing the advantage. Her posture remained calm and disciplined, the loose cuff still hanging from one wrist while she raised her hand slowly to show she was not advancing. Hayes looked up at her from the gravel, his breathing uneven now, the confidence that had carried him through the traffic stop replaced with pure shock. He had expected fear. He had expected hesitation. Instead, he had been disarmed by someone who moved with the quiet precision of a trained professional. Walker finally spoke. "Daniel, stop." Hayes pushed himself to his feet again, but the authority in his posture was gone. His eyes moved across the scene as if he were seeing it clearly for the first time. Tanya stood several feet away, calm and composed, her voice steady when she finally spoke again. "I told you I spent years learning how to control situations like this." Hayes said nothing. His hands hovered uncertainly near his belt as the reality of the moment settled into place. Passing vehicles slowed along the highway, drivers watching the scene unfold beneath the flashing patrol lights. Tanya continued calmly. "I did not attack you. I defended myself." The words were simple, but they carried the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly what had just happened. Hayes looked down at the fallen cuff on the pavement and then back at her again. The arrogance that had fueled his actions minutes earlier had vanished completely. In its place was something far more fragile. Realization. For the first time since he stepped out of the cruiser, Officer Daniel Hayes understood that the woman standing calmly in front of him had never been the powerless target he believed she was. The quiet stretch of highway seemed to hold its breath after Officer. Daniel Hayes stumbled and realized the situation had slipped completely out of his control. The fallen handcuff lay on the gravel between him and Tanya Brooks, glinting faintly under the flashing patrol lights. Hayes stood rigid now, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself, the arrogance that had fueled his actions earlier drained from his face. Officer Chris Walker moved quickly to pick up the dropped cuff, his eyes shifting between Hayes and Tanya with a seriousness that had not been there before. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this is over." Hayes said nothing. His gaze lingered on Tanya, as if he were still trying to understand how the moment had turned against him so quickly. Tanya remained composed, her stance relaxed but controlled, the loose cuff still hanging from one wrist where Hayes had never finished securing it. She slowly removed it and placed it carefully on the hood of the patrol cruiser. The simple gesture carried a quiet finality. Passing vehicles slowed along the highway, drivers noticing the unusual scene beneath the flashing lights. One car pulled onto the shoulder a short distance away, the driver stepping out and raising a phone to record what was happening. Hayes noticed the growing attention, and his shoulders dropped slightly as the reality of the situation settled in. "She attacked me," he said weakly, though the words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Walker shook his head. "No." The single word carried the weight of everything he had witnessed. Hayes looked toward the cruiser, then down at the gravel again. His earlier authority had evaporated completely. The radio on Walker's shoulder crackled suddenly, the voice from dispatch sharp through the quiet roadside air. "Unit 24, report situation status." Walker lifted the radio slowly. "Traffic stop escalated," he said carefully, requesting supervisor response. Hayes turned sharply toward him. "You are calling this in?" Walker met his eyes. It already happened. The answer hung in the air like a verdict. Tanya stepped back toward her car, giving both officers space. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again. "I told you to stop touching me." Hayes lowered his head slightly, the humiliation of the moment growing heavier as the patrol lights continued flashing across the empty road. Within minutes, another patrol vehicle appeared on the horizon, its lights cutting through the afternoon sunlight as it approached the scene. Walker exhaled quietly. Hayes remained motionless beside the cruiser, knowing that whatever explanation he tried to offer next would never erase the moment everyone had just witnessed. The quiet stretch of Route 17 slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm as the supervisor's patrol car rolled to a stop behind the flashing cruiser. Gravel crunched softly beneath the tires while the late afternoon sun continued drifting toward the horizon. Officer Daniel Hayes stood beside his vehicle with his shoulders lowered, the earlier tension replaced by the heavy stillness of someone who finally understood the consequences unfolding around him. The supervising officer stepped out and approached the scene with calm authority, his eyes moving from Hayes to Officer Chris Walker and finally to Tanya Brooks standing near her car. "What happened here?" the supervisor asked evenly. Walker answered before Hayes could speak. "Traffic stop escalated, sir. Force was used unnecessarily." Hayes looked down at the ground as the words settled into the air. The supervisor nodded slowly, taking in the dropped cuff on the cruiser hood and the small crowd of motorists who had gathered along the roadside. One driver still held the phone up, quietly recording the aftermath. The supervisor turned to Tanya. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Tanya nodded calmly. "I am fine." Her voice carried the same composed strength she had shown from the beginning. The supervisor then looked back toward Hayes. "Officer Hayes, step away from the vehicle." Hayes obeyed without argument. The earlier aggression had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet resignation. The supervisor removed the handcuffs from the cruiser and placed them back on Hayes's belt himself before speaking again. "You will return to the station immediately. There will be a review." Hayes said nothing. He simply nodded faintly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Walker moved quietly to gather the documents that had fallen earlier from Tanya's car and handed them back to her with a respectful nod. "I apologize for what happened," he said softly. Tanya accepted the papers and placed them neatly inside her vehicle. The wind carried the sound of passing cars again as the small roadside crowd slowly dispersed. One by one, the onlookers returned to their vehicles and continued down the highway. The supervisor signaled for Hayes to get into the patrol car, and within moments the flashing lights dimmed. Tanya stood beside her vehicle for a moment. Longer, the quiet road stretching ahead of her once more. She opened the driver's door, placed the documents carefully on the passenger seat, and started the engine. As her car merged back onto the highway, the entire scene faded behind her. The open road looked exactly the way it had before the traffic stop began. Yet for those who had witnessed the moment, the lesson remained unmistakable. True strength does not always raise its voice. Sometimes it simply stands its ground long enough for the truth to reveal itself. When you reflect on the moment that unfolded on that quiet highway, the most striking detail is how quickly confidence can collapse when it is built on assumption instead of understanding. Officer Hayes believed that the badge on his uniform automatically placed him in control of every person he encountered. In his mind, authority meant domination of the moment, the road, and the person standing in front of him. Yet Tanya Brooks never tried to overpower him with anger or fear. She relied on discipline, restraint, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you are capable of. What makes this story meaningful is not the physical reversal itself, but the contrast between impulse and composure. Hayes reacted from wounded pride and ego. Tanya responded with calm awareness and control. When those two approaches collided, the result revealed something deeper about human nature. Power that depends on intimidation is fragile because it must constantly prove itself. Power grounded in self-control does not need to prove anything at all. In the end, the road returned to silence, but the lesson remained clear to everyone who witnessed it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.